still be coming in. I'll at least start the intro. So welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on to this afternoon's program. Morning, I don't know what 12 is, where it lands. My name is Matt Schumann. I'm on the programming team here at Cary Library. Before we begin, just a few things to note. Please let me know in the chat if there are any technical issues that I can try to resolve. And if you have any questions or comments for our speaker today, please send them via the Q&A and we'll address them at the end. I'd like to thank LexSeeHer for putting together today's event and partnering with us. And now please welcome Leslie Massen from LexSeeHer.
Hello, and welcome to the LexSeeHer Speaker Series. I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, Jyoti Puri. Jyoti is the Hazel Dick Leonard Chair and Professor of Sociology at Simmons College and has received a Guggenheim Fellowship for a current project on death and migration. To quote her faculty page, she writes and teaches at the crossroads of sociology, sexuality studies, death studies, and post-colonial feminist theory. Jyoti is also LexSeeHer's first 2022 Women's Banner honoree to be announced. 3 Lexington Girl Scout troops helped create Jyoti's banner and those of the other amazing women we are celebrating. This August, because of the streetscape work, the banners will be hanging in Cary Library. Please visit Cary in August and discover LexSeeHer's 2020 banner honorees. And with that, welcome, Jyoti.
Leslie, thank you so much. Really, thank you for the warm welcome, as well as the incredible honor that LexSeeHer is doing to me and just the opportunity to give this talk. My heartfelt thanks to you all, Jesse, Valerie, Matt, Leslie, for your support. And to all of the participants, thank you for your interest. I do want to begin with a quick note. I am going to be talking about issues very much related to death and mourning, so just a heads up about that. Many years ago, a friend pulled up a photograph on his laptop of a migrant from colonial India being cremated in Canada in 1907. I reacted viscerally. It was really the combination of the image and the accompanying text that first tightened my stomach in a way that is yet to release. Matt, can we see the first image, please? Funeral for first Sikh who died in Vancouver in 1907. No permission was granted by the mayor or others. They took the deceased to a distant forest in the middle of the night and cremated the body in the morning. This is how this photograph is annotated. One among many religious groups in India, Sikhs were among the first to travel from India to the Pacific West, and like most Hindus, typically practiced cremation. As long-term or temporary migrants, people come to establish lives, not to die on foreign soil. But how did the early South Asian migrants manage unexpected death? What was it like to not be able to practice their death rites, to be banished to the wilderness of the forest, to have to mourn at the limits of the social? These questions remained with me, as did the image. While the rest of the image got fuzzy, what stayed with me is the South Asian man in the foreground and off center, standing amidst the woods and debris in the morning hours. Image 2, please. This, perhaps because a slice of the larger photo circulated separately at one time, and later the 2 images blurred together in my memory. He is the one I remember, hands in his pocket, looking pensively down at the scene. He is the one who reminded me about what it is like to be confronted with death in an unhomely place. Surely, death relates to time. A matter of the right time to go, the long life, premature loss, or taken too soon. A complicated dance between what is and what should be. Death too relates to space, where we live and where we die, where our remains lie, where the marked and unmarked graves are placed, where we become ancestors. As such, death raises questions about place, homeland, and host land, nations of origin, returns, and repatriation. Often endowed with more meaning than other rituals, funerals and mourning are vital practices that dignify migrant life and mediate a sense of belonging to the nation, its land, and territory. This photo has inspired my current project on death and migration. More specifically, I am studying cremations among Sikhs and Islamic burials among Muslim migrants from India and other countries in South Asia. The next slide, please. Especially Bangladesh and Pakistan, from the early 20th century to the present. This focus is a departure from my previous research in many ways. As Leslie was talking about my bio, for the last 25 years of my career as a sociologist, I have investigated issues of gender, sexuality, state, and nation. My books and articles have been motivated by the need to understand how gender and sexuality are regulated by states and nations, but also how gender and sexuality shape these institutions in turn. At heart, I have been examining the exercise of power as well as challenges to it in settings such as India and the United States. All of the research projects are scaffolded by sociology, which is my primary discipline. Sociology's origins are usually traced to 19th century Europe, but the truth is that its roots go much further. For example, the sociological contributions of the 14th, 15th century Arab thinker, Ibn Khaldun. Matt, the next image, please. Although sociology, like other disciplines, is hard to encapsulate, the American Sociological Association offers a definition. Next slide. Sociology is the study of social life, social change, and the social causes and consequences of human behavior. My understanding of sociology is shaped by transnational feminism, which encourages attention to issues of power, gender, sexual, and racial inequities, and the legacies of colonialism and nationalism. This grounding in sociology, transnational feminism, and other allied disciplines, such as history and literature, enable my current project on death and migration. This interdisciplinary project is based on sustained and systematic research occurring over several years. It requires developing expertise in new areas and in new forms of research. For example, while I have experience in both fieldwork and interviewing, I'm learning much more about archival research methods. This kind of sustained and systematic inquiry is different from the careful research that may happen in, let's say, journalism. Journalists and journalistic writers have been at the forefront of incisive and thoroughly researched publications on a wide range of topics. But as sociologists, we carry the additional burden of working within our discipline, of engaging its histories and concepts, explaining why something is sociologically relevant, utilizing its possibilities, and even expanding the discipline's boundaries. Take the case of sociology of death, a field that started to consolidate around the 1970s in the US. The next slide, please. Colleges and universities began offering immensely popular courses on death and dying, and textbooks were written at the time. Currently, a large number of such books introduce students to matters of death and dying, and many have gone into multiple editions. In these books, the emphasis is on the social influences of individual grief, that is, how society and culture shape our personal grief and mourning processes. Undoubtedly, these are crucial aspects of social life that must be studied and circulated. But the scale of death heightened by the COVID-19 pandemic, gun violence, and state-sanctioned violence on Black and Brown communities in the United States points us toward the urgencies of understanding the collective, communal, and geopolitical aspects of death. In the last several years, Matters of death and mourning have catapulted into the front pages of our lives, and we need to contend with why particular groups and particular communities are at heightened risk. For instance, Indigenous and Brown migrant communities who have disproportionately borne the impact of the pandemic. How do we, for instance, contend with poet Claudia Rankine's evocative words that the condition of Black life is one of mourning? Matt, next slide, please. How then do we move away from an individual focus on grief and grieving to a collective one, particularly at a moment when we're continually seeing reports and images of war in Ukraine and so many other parts of the world, where grief and mourning are not only to be experienced at a personal level, but can be the basis of collective action? Grappling with these questions has been eye-opening and has helped me see that for sociologists and other social scientists, funerary practices must be understood not as matters of individual loss and grief, but as collective and communal experiences and challenges. In this project, I begin with writings from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries from Americans traveling to what is generally called the East. At the time, because of improvements in technology and tourism infrastructures, an unprecedented number of white, elite, and middle-class Americans began visiting foreign places. Some of them wrote long travel accounts running into hundreds of pages. Immensely popular among American readers, these travel logs have been described as the virtual reality of its time. To date, renowned writer Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad is the all-time best-selling travel book in the United States. Next slide, please. What's remarkable about Twain's book and most others is that they typically describe death rites in far-flung places such as colonial India, China, Japan, and Egypt. That is, how people disposed of the dead. Invariably, cremation in India was discussed in the strongest words, and writers described their horror and disgust at the sight of bodies burning in cremation grounds. Writer upon writer sought out cremation grounds in Calcutta, Bombay, as well as Varanasi, which is of particular significance to upper caste Hinduism, only to share their feelings and denounce the rites. Burial practices in China, too, were seen as flawed. For instance, next slide, please. In Round the World, tycoon turned philanthropist Andrew Carnegie depicts the city of Shanghai only to reflect on what he sees as the obstacle to development: graves. He goes on, and here, this I quote, "China is one vast cemetery. Go where you will, in any direction, the mounds of the dead intrude upon you at every step." He adds that the Chinese favor having the dead close, preferably buried in their own land, a practice Carnegie founds revolting. For travel writers, how people deal with death becomes a measure of them. Rather than attempting contextual understandings of funerary rites and why people do what they do, writers reflect on who people are. Therefore, portrayals add to general beliefs and feelings about colonial India and other parts of Asia. Death rites become significant commentaries, not just on rites and rituals, but what these practices say about a people, their culture, and civilization. In this view, people who would incinerate the dead reveal a fundamental disregard for life and bodies. This is in sharp contrast to the West in the latter part of the 19th century, when the bodies of the deceased are becoming more important to the living. For American writers, such apparent disregard in foreign places was bound with racial inferiority, the lack of humanity, and civilizational imperfections and impossibilities. Furthermore, writings on foreign death rites contributed to an evolutionary scale in which white Christian settler beliefs were the pinnacle of civilization. Next slide, please. This is to say, cremations and burial practices in the so-called East were used to determine the extent to which a people are civilized, even as civilization is defined by the tenets of white Christianity. Thus, Chinese burial customs fare better than Indian cremation rites in travel writings, and Japan ranks higher than China, while completely outdoing India. Within the first few pages on Japan, another travel writer and a one-time New York senator, Henry Seward, takes readers to a Japanese cemetery. Next slide, please. Supplemented by an illustration of the cemetery, the text describes Japanese death ways, including cremations and details about burials, how bodies are interred in seated position, in plain boxes, women are not part of the funeral procession, the general lack of funerary pomp and circumstance, and the overcrowding of cemeteries. And that's the illustration that you're seeing. These travel writings of Americans visiting colonial India and other parts of Asia and Africa shaped how migrants arriving into the US were perceived. Indians began reaching North American shores in the hundreds by the early 20th century. Dislocated by colonialism, they left behind economic lack, famine, and death at home, only to find themselves in a setting already marked by misinformation and stereotypes about colonial India and other parts of the East. Newspapers and periodicals, too, from that time period routinely carried descriptions about migrant funerals, paying special attention to cremations and their minute details. Next slide, please. Filled with misreadings and misinterpretations, these reports went a long way in shaping how South Asian migrants were understood in relation to their death rights and as a people. Matt, can we see the next slide, please?
Oh, sorry, it had, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And no worries if you're having any technical issues.
Do you see the next slide here?
No, we don't.
Oh, is now?
Yes, now we do. Thank
Okay.
you. Researching this, so this is just a snapshot of, an example from a newspaper. Researching these histories has also shed important light on our present. Muslim and Sikh communities have to continually navigate death on foreign soil as a result of dominant nationalisms and local and state level governance. May we see the next slide? Okay, that's part of the same one. And if you can just advance it. There we go. Thank you. In tens of cases across the United States, Muslim communities have been denied access to Islamic burial grounds due to residents' prejudices and racisms. 2 such cases have occurred in Massachusetts, Dudley and Walpole. Thus, studying funerary rites points to a story of death as a site of social inequality and social exclusion. At the same time, the research underscores the need to analyze death as a site of forging community, especially as people come together to participate in funerals, pool money to cover funerary expenses, and mourn collectively. Equally informative are insights into how death solidifies migrants' ties to places and often redoubles their efforts to belong to the US despite raging anti-immigrant sentiments. Therefore, investigating Sikh cremations and Muslim burials etches a sociological understanding of death as shaped by the power of American nationalism and its antipathies toward non-Christian brown immigrants. While migrant experiences and efforts teach us about how they continue to challenge these nationalist ideologies and racisms. Such lessons have ripple effects. 1, investigating death rights among South Asian migrants has underscored the need for analyzing the power of institutions and ideologies, but also the significance of human agency. That is, where there is power, there is struggle and activism. 2, It has helped me see the paradoxes of life and death more clearly. The recent assault on reproductive rights brought on by the undoing of Roe v. Wade is a case in point. In India, where I grew up, abortion has never been a moral question. And in the last decade, courts have upheld women's rights to autonomy and decision-making regarding pregnancy. The situation on women's reproductive rights is less than perfect. And there are many ways that the callous disregard for bodies of Muslims, Dalits, and indigent communities is reflected in everyday life in India. But this trend toward protecting women's reproductive rights has been steadily sweeping other parts of the world, including Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, and Ireland. In contrast, the U.S. has reversed the clock on women's bodily autonomy. To me, concern is not only the way that Dobbs versus Jackson imperils women's lives, especially the lives of women of color. It is also how the decision pits the rights of the woman with the rights of the fetus. This is to say, the pregnant body is reduced to a spectacle for the fetus. That is to say, the pregnant body is reduced to a receptacle for the fetus, and even for the fetus, life matters only until birth. This renders all pregnant bodies, even those pregnant by choice, into receptacles or surrogates. Surrogacy is common among people seeking to have children, and many Americans have been utilizing this option. While they may recruit women in the United States, they have also frequently looked to India and Mexico as the cheaper options. Surrogates are paid and contractually obligated to hand over the child upon birth. As the research suggests, surrogacy is beset with numerous problems, not the least of which are ethical and moral. So what then does it mean when Dobbs versus Jackson opens a door to many states now seeking to restrict or completely ban access to abortion? To what extent does that imperil the lives, but also the emotional and physical well-being of the people who are compelled to carry fetuses to term? Is this not, in fact, a fundamental disregard for the body, the living, and for humanity that Americans have long criticized in others? What does it mean for questions of life and death when pregnancy is modeled after surrogacy? That is, the pregnant body is a surrogate whose life and well-being are secondary and even incidental. Thank you.
I'm sort of speechless. So I can't even formulate questions right now. That was really wonderful. Thank you.
I know it's a lot to take in, and I think obviously, people have been thinking a lot about the overturning of Roe v. Wade, but I think the issues about thinking more broadly of death as a sociological phenomenon, as a social collective phenomenon, I imagine that's a lot to take in. And yeah.
This, I don't know if this is related, this brought back a conversation I was having with someone about probably 15 years ago. And she's an immigrant to this country, and she could not get over the number of churches. And it occurred to me while you were speaking that one reason immigrant groups would bring their own churches with them was for their funeral rites. Mm-hmm. And it isn't just for the social, the living social aspect, it's also for the death aspect of it.
Absolutely.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and that's right. That is so true. And as I've been doing research around Sikh temples or mosques in the Boston area and elsewhere, to me, one of the remarkable things is how much they talk about death, or how much the imams or the Sikh priests are actually educating people about, okay, this is what happens about death, this is what needs to be done, at the same time, here are the constraints, and this is how to navigate it.
Right.
You know, because one of the sort of in sociology, one of the fundamental points, one of the insights, one of the established insights is that in the United States, death has become increasingly sequestered. And there's, you know, some evidence about it, right? Sort of when passing happens, people look to the funeral home, or, you know, it is sort of handed over, the body is handed over to the, it's often death is happening in hospitals. It then is taken over by the funeral home. And so that there is this sort of separation that has happened, you know, between the living and the dead to a degree. But when I look at it from, you know, the perspective of migrants or even other marginalized communities, death is up close. It is just constantly present as something to be thought through or to be experienced. I do see a question. Barbara, would you, do we have the ability to have participants unmute themselves?
Yeah, I can elevate someone to be able to talk.
Thank you. I would love to have people join the conversation if you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, no, I was just interested in, you know, it seems as a society, there are certain events and certain types of, you know, like large scale deaths where we consider them legitimate and we pay attention to them as a society, and then other ones we kind of suppress them or don't pay attention to them. And, you know, I'm thinking of COVID in the short run, you know, that there's this huge amount of loss of life. And it seems like we're sort of like moving on without paying attention to it.
I think, Barbara, that is so true. And, you know, a piece that I wrote a little while ago, I was just noticing the same thing, you know, particularly under the previous administration, where COVID was, you know, itself acknowledging it, its extent, the numbers, how to deal with it, that in itself was so embattled. There was no attempt at the federal level at the time to actually mark, you know, to mourn, to have a kind of a national mourning, because we saw this scale of death the last time, you know, in terms of the United States, this was 9/11, right?
Right.
And the kind of outpouring, the national mourning that occurred at the time, and rightly so. The country is in shock. This is, you know, it's a huge loss of life. There is a kind of collective suffering that is happening. But COVID-19 surpassed that very quickly. And this was, again, under the last administration, under that 4-year term. And the sort of that there was no acknowledgement of that publicly, no attempt to create some kind of process for national mourning, never mind a monument. And I think that sense of, that created another sense of loss. So I think in terms of, you know, your point about how death and collective or large death at a larger scale, how that quickly gets politicized is absolutely right on. And the point about which wars we mourn and which we forget, or what seems as just routine because, well, those people are just fighting each other all the time, versus then what comes into the front pages. I agree with you very much.
So you were talking about the loss of Roe, and I'm just curious, how do you think we know that more women are going to die? I mean, we just know it. The stories that are already coming out are pretty horrific, and I'm just curious that how do you think we as a society will deal with that, because it is political, unfortunately.
Yep.
And it's like, you know, like the Barbara, I can't remember her last name, the artist who says your body is a battleground. I mean, yeah. Literally women's bodies have become a battleground now. And I'm just curious if you have any ideas of what in your crystal ball, if you could.
You know, I think the crystal ball is always sort of, that's a hard one, right? I mean, yeah. how the sort of collective moves and or how collectives become divided, because I mean, I think that's really what we're seeing at this point. Right. You know, huge divisions. And to me, the question is, in part, I wanted to actually end on the question of Roe, precisely because I think it is pointing toward histories of activism that have been long in place, that brought into being Roe to begin with.
Right.
The activism that has been occurring, because Roe has been under assault for decades now. The people, different constituencies around the country have been chipping away at it, making access harder and harder. I think the relative surprise, or even to a degree, the shock, was that somehow the chipping away would continue, but that itself, which has been established precedent for almost 50 years, that would somehow, hold, that integrity would still be in place. And we see that that's not the case. And so I think the ways in which this is going to energize, particularly young people, is where we're going to see the action. And I think in that sense, I think all is not lost, because in some ways this is a hope, but in many ways this is an expectation, is that this is created a new generation of activists.
Right.
To have this kind, I think, as you said, the body becomes a battleground. And in some ways, our bodies are always battleground for almost everybody, right? In terms of what is possible and what's not. Euthanasia, for example, right? That it's not up to us, that there is a whole sort of procedure. Our body in that sense is not our own, and at some level never has been our own. But to have this kind of regulation and this level of scrutiny, which is about, where bodies are literally being reduced to receptacles. Right. It doesn't matter. You have to carry something to term. So to me, that is, it doesn't get any more personal. It doesn't get any more intimate. And the consequences of it are just, are so immediate that I think this is going to be, this might very well be another kind of turning point, the consequences of which we don't understand at this point, or we can't foresee at this point.
Well, I think it's probably the first time, except for prohibition, that a right has been taken away. This was a constitutional right that was taken away. So I think that's also one reason why people had trouble thinking that this could ever happen, because you don't take away constitutional rights.
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely. And, this is when you think about sort of that listing, and we've been talking about this for so long now, the terminology of human rights. Is not only is it a constitutional right, but it seems to me it's a fundamental human right? That sort of some sense of autonomy over one's body. And so to have that be eroded.
Right.
One of the things that human rights activists, or people who've been using and working within the language of human rights for a long time, have also been pointing out that maybe rights is also not even enough, that we need to think about human needs.
Okay.
As a way to really to consider what are the imperatives, where are literally the needs. And if this is not a human right and a human need, then I don't know what is.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Jesse, would you like us to read this out? Would you?
No, actually, I would love to share it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I was thinking about how some people have observed, and includes some people in my family who are Catholic, have different burial rights if a baby is born, stillborn, or if a baby is born and lives for a short amount of time. And so in a conversation with someone who was sharing that her pregnancies ended differently, and she was Catholic, and she was not allowed to have the same burial. And so she's someone who supports abortion rights and has sort of brought that up. And I hadn't been aware of these different funeral rights. And I'm thinking about what you've seen in other cultures around babies. And then lastly, Leslie and I were on a search for Leslie's research project in a cemetery. And we saw in the cemetery a special place where they had babies of indigent mothers buried. And it was just interesting where I couldn't remember exactly, Leslie, but you will. And it's just really curious about what you've seen around this
Well,
group of mothers or babies.
let me expand on that. That wasn't, I mean, I think that the area we were in may have been just indigent babies of indigent parents, but I have been to many, I happen like going to cemeteries. I've been to many cemeteries where there are whole sections just for babies. And what I find heart-wrenching is that they're off, the graves are often unmarked. And for me, that's like a sign of trauma, that it's just so traumatic that the parents just can't go back. But it's always struck me, these fields of infants and stillborn children. It's actually sort of traumatizing just being there.
Yeah. And Leslie, to Jesse's point, that these are, because where we see unmarked graves are oftentimes associated with orphanages or indigenous native communities, the sort of the residences that were established where native children were taken away from their parents and actually forced. So that's where we typically see unmarked graves. And I remember also in terms of, places where single mothers had to give up their children. Right. And then when the babies died, again, the sort of the unmarking, so that the point that I guess I'm raising is that the unmarking is also a deliberate strategy to not allow mourning in burials, right? Because there's no place to go, there's no place to visit, there's no place to land your grief.
Yeah, the two very interesting cemeteries in this area is one of the former mental institutions, and of the cemetery is split by Protestant, which is P, and Catholic, which is C. And then everything is a number, except there are 2 or I think 3 headstones. And the other one is at the Correctional Institute at the Concord Roundabout, the cemetery there. And all of the headstones there they're literally numbers, and some of them, including someone put their finger in concrete and wrote the number out. I mean, first there was some structure, some ritual, and then it just got down to someone's putting their finger in the concrete. It was that was disturbing. Though recently they have allowed flags to be put up for veterans. So that was like, in some ways, you could finally mark someone. You could give them some form of identity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think this that's exactly right. And I think to circle back to Jesse, your point about the sort of the fetus that is the outcome of an abortion, even being denied that, right? There are the sort of the normal or the sanctioned Catholic burial rites, but then somehow this becomes about this is a punitive measure that the outcome of an abortion does not deserve that. But to me, I sort of find that very curious, because I think it was until the 1870s where even the Catholic Church allowed abortion until what was called the quickening of the fetus. So that this kind of turn and this kind of surveillance, in a sense, about what is permitted when, I think these are all about calculations on when life can be respected in death and when it cannot be, right? Like whose death is to be respected.
I think that and I may be wrong, so if someone can correct me, but the reason that that stillborn children or aborted children, fetuses, are treated differently within the Catholic rituals than live-born children is that the concept of original sin, that if you are born live, then you have taken on the cloak of original sin. But if you're not alive when you're born, then it means that you're literally pure.
Yeah.
So, and it's
Post your mother.
Well, yeah, or anybody. So it's the whole point of baptism. So.
Yeah. No, I think those are good. I'm actually going to look into this, delve into this further, just as sort of a point of interest. And, but I do Leslie, just going back to another point that you made earlier, and Jesse was asking about sort of, the kind of variation that we see with children or babies and infants. Even in India, among Hindus who typically will cremate bodies, in the past, and I don't know how widespread this still is, infants or children I think it's under the age of 6, are buried because they're just, there's just something about, to your point, Leslie, the trauma of losing infants or children that, calls for a kind of a different ritual. And so they used to be buried as opposed to cremated.
Yeah, I'm interested in archaeology in the Southwest, and there are ruins where they have found very young children and fetuses buried within the room structure. And sometimes you find adults, but it's very interesting that it's like keep that child close somehow.
And Leslie, was this among African American communities or?
Oh, no, this is like pre-colonial, pre-contact.
Oh, pre-contact.
In the Southwest, yeah, pre-contact.
Yeah. I was just thinking about this because within some African communities, they used to actually bury bodies under the floor. Mm-hmm. Right. So again, the whole point of it is that proximity, the intimacy. You keep your ancestors close to you.
Right. And I think I don't want, I can go off on the anthropology and archaeology of that forever, but I mean, different cultures have different reasons of dealing with their dead, and that we can't always understand them or even appreciate them. I mean, something that seems horrific to us is, to them, is unthinkable if it doesn't occur.
Absolutely. And I think that's very well said. And I think that is the issue with, some of the travel writing that I'm looking at the time. And these are people who are, relatively progressive and liberal, like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie and others. But that, that effort to try to understand contextually, right? Sort of what is the reasoning? What is happening? What am I seeing here? And to look to local people to help with those interpretations doesn't exist. Most of the time, they're the people who are their tour guides are other white Europeans. And so, what they're presenting for their readers is basically what they're seeing,
right?
Without calling into question, am I interpreting this correctly?
Right. No analysis at all. I mean,
yeah.
Do you still have questions?
Yeah. Sorry. Barbara, would you like to share this?
I mean, I'm old enough to remember both the Vietnam War and the Vietnam War Memorial, which was about 20 years later. And it was the war was so controversial and very hard on the country, and a lot of soldiers bear the brunt of the general point of view that it was a bad war and so forth. And when the Vietnam War Memorial was built in Washington, D.C., it just had such a profound impact on everybody. And I don't know if you've never had a chance to see it, it's just a tremendous experience. And it seems like its job was to make up for the lack of proper homage that was given at the time.
Yeah.
Can I add a comment?
Yeah.
I think, Barbara, to what you're saying is such an interesting comment on the monument project in Lexington, because Kathy Jacob in an earlier talk talked about how public monuments give us meaning and they give us memory. And so if you think about like Lexington in 1760, everybody went to the same meeting house. The burial ground had these markers of people's lives and everybody knew everybody. And then when you think about where we are today, with so many of us are not from here, we're not born here, we've moved here at whatever stage of life, that church burial ground doesn't have the same meaning anymore. And so the monuments we see, to Barbara's point, are what we see as sort of tourists or visitors. And we look to people who are local historians to be the experts and interpret for us. And I think it ties in so beautifully with, I think, where many of us have come in the monument project, that without the monument, there's no sign that women were here at all. You just lose the entire experience of more than half the population.
I mean, I think that's the work, as you're pointing out, that monuments and memorials do. And it's, in so many cases, it's about sort of the recovering of lost histories, right? Leslie, the project that you were talking about, or Jesse is referring to, this is about lost histories. And I think it also, again, goes to that sort of point about what is memorialized and what then is seen as deserving the monument. So I was thinking, actually, as you were talking, Barbara, about the Vietnam War Memorial, I was also thinking about the Arlington National Cemetery. That toward, as the Civil War is raging, that becomes seen as a necessity to honor the dead and to really create a kind of a national story about who we are and who needs to be memorialized. And, it's a way of writing history as well, isn't it?
Well, and what's interesting about that cemetery is that it was on Robert E. Lee's ground. That was his house. So it was sort of saying, this is what you have done.
Yep. Yeah. And at the same time, sort of complicating all of those,
Right.
Narratives, and also creating, it's about creating heroes and creating more histories and lineages,
Right.
and also the sort of the problem of how do we manage the dead with a war like this, right? I mean, the sort of the number of lives lost. I mean, how do they get managed? And that was also a turning point. That was, this was really interesting and has been written about. That was also the point when embalming started in the United States.
Right.
Which is taken as such a convention and something that is so widely practiced at this point, begins at the time. So, which is also helpful to remember. So many of the procedures and protocols that seem so normal and so essential are also artifacts of history.
And they're codified. You have to have certain things done. There's no choice about it.
Right, but you don't. We know, it didn't always happen.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So Leslie, if I may ask you, that maybe other people want to chime in, I'll give it another moment. So I wondered if you wanted to, I'm curious what took you to the Concord Cemetery, or the Southwest, sort of the archaeological, anthropological projects. I would love to hear a bit.
I grew up in California, and my parents used to hang along with my father was a chaperone for the field trips when I was a kid. So I spent a lot of time in the Southwest, and I just became really fascinated with it. And I took a brief hiatus from studying it. And then within the last 15, 20 years, I've sort of jumped back in. But I find cemeteries really fascinating because they tell you a lot about the people, how people are thought of, what is important to people. I mean, you go to, the dogs are about to bark a lot, I'm sorry. You go to places, with huge mausoleums for like one person, and then you go to, but another place's cemetery, there's just something very simple. And sometimes, for example, there's a cemetery I walk through quite often to get somewhere else, and someone has been buried for quite a while. And, they have those little plaques that the funeral home puts there, and they're like 2 or 3 years old, and no one has been with them. I actually, when I was in college, that's how I found out about the flu epidemic. I was wandering through a cemetery. Colma is outside of San Francisco, and when San Francisco was, they started rebuilding, they took everyone out of the cemeteries and moved them to Colma. And so this is huge. And I remember walking down an aisle and there were all of these tombstones in French, and everyone died within like 5 days of each other. And I thought, whoa, what happened? And I was talking to my mom about it, and she said, well, there was this flu epidemic. So there's things you can learn, so much you can learn.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's so interesting and helpful. And one of the things that crosses my mind is this is what makes cremation more complicated.
Yes,
there is, people talk about the archaeologies of cremation as being somehow, a tautology, right? Sort of a contradiction, not a tautology, but an oxymoron, in the sense of where are the traces? Because there is no, typically with cremations, there have been no memorialization. There is no, the remains don't exist anymore, or not even something that is marking the remains. And to me, this raises so many interesting questions about the place of the body in various religious traditions, cultural traditions, and how it is, how with burials and through cemeteries, the body becomes the instrument for this kind of memorialization, for monuments. But with cremation, the whole point of it is to disintegrate the body, right? To not let
right. Well, I think it also, I mean, in some cultures, it allows the soul to leave.
Exactly. Within the Hindu or the Sikh traditions, the whole point of it is to release the soul, that the body is the cage that needs to be kind of opened up. And so, it's just really interesting questions about memory and history and body.
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot you can do with cremains. And I mean, there's that whole industry of making diamonds out of cremains, which my husband says I'm not allowed to do. But we have our dog's ashes.
Yeah. And
I have, I hate to say it, my father's in a box right now waiting for my mom to die, so I can put them where they want to be together. I mean, that's actually you're right. It's the weird thing about cremation is that sometimes it just disappears, but sometimes it's literally something you are carrying with you.
And I think the cremains, from what I can see and understand, the very premise of cremains becomes more widespread in the United States as cremation takes root. So cremation is now sort of, more than 50% of people prefer that as an option. And that instead of then holding on to the body, the cremains come to stand in its place. Right. Whereas among Sikhs, the remains are actually put into the water. There are no remains, right? The ultimate sort of the conclusion of the rite is in fact to let even the remains of the body disappear. So
yeah, we're watching, my husband and I are watching For All Mankind. And if anyone isn't into season 3, close your ears. And there is a burial in space. And that really, I found I was surprised, but I found it disturbing, because a burial at sea, that the body's going to decompose and it goes back to the earth. But with a burial in space, all I could think of was all that cold and forever. It was really, it had something I hadn't thought about. So sorry. I can go on about death for a long time. So.
Me too. So yeah, there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be understood, really.
Yeah. Any more questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank you then. Matt, is there any questions lurking that we don't see?
I don't see any more, but I just wanted to say thank you to both of you. This was a fantastic and
thank you.
Deep program. This was recorded, so it will be on the library's YouTube channel, and I don't know if elsewhere. I don't know if there was a LexSeeHer channel.
We rely on you. So
Okay, yes, sorry, I had forgotten.
it's okay.
But thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The pleasure was mine. Really, I enjoyed the conversation, and thank you to all for attending, but all of you. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Jesse, Matt. Very, very grateful.
Right.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye. Bye.